For those who don't know me, I'm Panos Thafas. I'm the president of Macedonian Society of Great Britain. It's really great to see you here, to see familiar faces and new faces. And that's important for us because over the last 2 years, all of our events were online due to the pandemic. So it's really nice to have you here with us tonight here at the Hellenic Center. So before we start, let me say a few words about our society. The Macedonian Society of Great Britain was founded in London in 1989 by members of the Greek community in the UK. It's a registered charity and a member society of the Hellenic Center. The primary aim of the society is the promotion of the Hellenic heritage of Macedonia. Our main source of funding is grants by various foundations and donations from the public. We are truly privileged to have the support of the AG Leventis Foundation for several years now, who is also our main sponsor tonight. But as we all know, money cannot buy time. So I reach out to you and invite any of you that are interested and have a bit of time to spare to come and join us in order to help the society to continue to operate by organizing events that promote the Hellenic heritage and culture here in the UK and beyond. Today's event is dedicated to Byzantine Thessaloniki, and I'm really glad that we managed to put together a brilliant group of really passionate people, truly passionate speakers, to talk about Thessaloniki during the Byzantine era. Dr. Maria Xanthou is Senior Research Associate at the University of Bristol and Research Associate in Pindaric Studies at the Center for Hellenic Studies of Harvard University in Washington, D.C. She worked as Junior Research Fellow in the Social and Cultural Construction of Emotions, the Greek Paradigm Project in Oxford from 2009 to 2013. She taught classics, ancient, medieval, and Byzantine history at Aristotle University, Hellenic Open University, Open University of Cyprus, University of Bristol, and University of Leeds. In 2020, she was visiting fellow at Seeger Center for Hellenic Studies at Princeton University, and in 2015, she was residential fellow at CHS at Harvard University. Throughout her academic career, she was awarded academic scholarships from Aristotle University Academic Excellence Scheme, Hellenic State Scholarships Foundation, and Nicos and Lydia Trichas Foundation for Education and European Culture. Dr. Anastasios Tantsis is an associate professor of Byzantine archaeology at the School of History and Archaeology of the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki in Greece. He studied architecture, Byzantine archaeology, and he received his PhD on Byzantine church architecture in 2008. During 2005 to 2007, he was an international visiting scholar at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, working with Robert Austhurst. He teaches Byzantine archaeology, museology, architectural history, and architectural preservation, both on undergraduate and graduate level in the School of History and Archaeology at the School of Architecture at the Aristotle University. He authored Architectural Synthesis in Byzantium and Introduction in 2012, and several papers focusing on church architecture and issues of patronage and ideology. He has published on the monuments of Mistras and is currently preparing a book on his church architecture. Last but not least, Mr. Henry Hopwood-Phillips works at Bismarck Analysis as a specialist in Eurasian geopolitics, having worked in the media for most of his life, including stints at TRT World and CCTV. He used COVID-19 to author a book on the topography of Constantinople, which is currently with a publisher. His proudest achievement is his imitation of P.L. Fermore's Odyssey, when he, aged 19, walked from Athens to Constantinople armed with a dozen books on the Eastern Roman Empire. He tweets daily about Byzantium, at Twitter obviously, where he is also known as Byzantine ambassador. So Henry has kindly accepted to chair the session and lead the discussion in Q&A. So thank you, Henry. And without further ado, I give you our panelists.
First of all, I would like to begin by thanking our attendees, Mr. John Karas and Dr. Panos Dafas, for their kind generosity. And of course, last but not least, I would like to thank Henry, Hopwood-Phillips. Well, in the past, in antiquity, people used to meet in the forum. I met Henry in the digital forum of Twitter. And I'm very happy and glad for this, so thank you, Henry, for making this happen. I also would like to thank my colleague, Professor Anastasios Tantsis, who is an expert on Byzantine archaeology, and he is going to tell you more about monuments and Byzantine archaeology in Thessalonica. Today I'm going to give you an overview about the history of Thessalonica, its cultural life. But first of all, let me go through the monuments, the remnant, and their modern urban surroundings in order to understand the space. Thessalonica was founded around 315 by King Cassander. And what you see here is an inscribed base of a statue of Thessaloniki. It's dated on the 2nd century BC. You can see it in the Archaeological Museum. And Cassander, in a way, founded Thessaloniki based on a conglomerate of small villages. So keep that in mind for later. This is an image I've selected from an icon of St. Demetrius. It's much later. It's dated in the 16th century from the Byzantine Museum of Antivouniotia in Corfu. And here you can see, I picked it especially because it represents Thessaloniki encircled by its walls. Here you see the modern urban plan of Thessalonica before its expansion eastwards and westwards. And as you can see, it is surrounded by its old walls. And now the city has kept these limits in the what we call the modern urban city center, but now it's much larger. Here, for example, you can see some children strolling on the Byzantine wall, and here it goes right down up to the port. Okay, somewhere over there is Rotunda, and over there is the Thermae Gulf. By the way, this part of the port and further down here, it was used by the British fleet during the First World War. Here is the reconstruction of Galerios' palatial complex of Thessalonica. I've picked these images in order to give you an understanding how to have an understanding how the Roman city looked like, and this massive construction project by Galerios, whose parts still survive. Although I know that my colleague Anastasios Tantsis disagrees, and he has every right to disagree with this reconstruction, it is an efficient way for students to understand how Byzantine, Roman and Byzantine Thessaloniki looked like. And by the way, this is also where the slaughter of Theodosius also took place. So here is also a part of Rotunda, again with the disclaimer, of course, that archaeologists disagree with the reconstruction. And again, an overview of the Hippodrome. Now, this is how Rotunda looks like right now with its modern surroundings. As you see, the buildings, the modern urban buildings are here. Here we have the last surviving minaret of the Ottoman period, and of course here you see these massive constructions, modern constructions surrounding the place, and here are the walls up, the Byzantine walls, which go to what we call the upper city, the old upper city. Now, let me give you some historical setting and milestones about what Thessaloniki was all about. I'm not going to discuss the Hellenistic and Roman era. I'm going to focus exclusively on the Byzantine era. On 617, we have the first recorded siege of Thessalonica by Avars, which was a Turkish tribe, and of Sklaveni, probably a Slavic nation. Of course, the source of this is the massive text of Miracles of St. Demetrius, which Henry will talk about later. And here you can see an example of the manuscript. Again, in 676 until 678, we have another unsuccessful siege of Thessalonica by Sklaveni, again documented in the Miracles of St. Demetrius. In the 9th century, during the so-called Byzantine Renaissance, St. Cyril and St. Methodius, the two Byzantine Christian theologian missionaries, devised the Glagolitic alphabet. They were linked with Patriarch Photius. They were sent to various missions to the Slavs, first to the Khazars and ultimately to Great Moravia. And also they compiled or wrote the first Slavic civic code. And I have placed the Bashka tablet, which is an early example of Glagolitic script found in Croatia. And here is also a miniature by a Slavic, a manuscript written in a Slavic script. As you know, the Byzantines were very effective. When they didn't want to make war, they tried, to take some nations, to Christianize some nations as a way to bring them towards their side. Another big event was the sack of Thessalonica, which took place in 904 AD by the Abbasid Caliphate's navy, led by a renegade who was called Leo of Tripoli, a Muslim convert. What's the source of this sack? It was a story written by John Kameniatis, and here, of course, we have again a miniature by the famous Madrid Skilitzis manuscript. As you see, these are the ships, in a way, landing to the port of Thessaloniki. The next sack of Thessalonica was by the Normans of the Kingdom of Sicily, because the Normans tried to retaliate to the Andronikos Komnenos massacre of the Latins in Constantinople in April 1182. The sack was documented by the Archbishop of Thessalonica, Anastasios of Thessaloniki, a person of formidable erudition. He was also a philologist. He wrote many works, and I'm going to present him to you later. In 1204, the sack of Constantinople by the Fourth Crusade led to the foundation of the Kingdom of Thessalonica, alias known as the Regnum of Thessaloniki or Vasilion tes Thessalonikis. And here you can see how, how long was extended. I mean, it was part of Chalkidiki, some of Thessaly, also of central Greece. The kingdom of Thessalonica lasted between 1224 until 1246, and Theodore Komnenos Doukas acted as an emperor of Thessalonica. Here you can see him standing and also facing the figure of Theotokos. Here is the face of Theotokos. And also Theodore and Saint Demetrius standing facing, holding a castle between them. In 1230, we have the defeat of Theodore Doukas Komnenos at Klokotnitsa, and the Empire of Thessalonica becomes a vassal state of the Second Bulgarian Empire. The Empire of Nicaea survives, which was formed after the 1204 and survives until 1261. The Byzantines tried to retrieve Thessalonica during the Empire of Nicaea. And in 1342-1350, we have the movement of the Zealots. This movement, although some people understated, it's, I think, one of the most important civic and civil movements, and in a way predates the Paris Commune. It was established mainly through financial reasons. People wanted, of course, a redistribution of land. They also wanted to confront the rich people. So in a way, they tried to establish a republic. Of course, this republic was short-lived, but anyway, it is a very good example how professional associations, and you can see that in Daphnis Papadatous's article, Political Associations in the Late Byzantine Empire, the Zealots and Sailors of Thessalonica, how the professional associations played a crucial role in the social and financial life of Thessalonica. And there are also, I added 3 other works. The one is by Konstantinos Kotsiopoulos. Unfortunately, all of them are written in modern Greek, and a recent one published in 2021 by Panayotis Tsapogas. It is called The Movement of the Zealots in Thessalonica. I would like to single out Professor Matsoukas' book, Zilotika, which is actually a novel. Professor Matsoukas, who used to be professor of theology at Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, wrote a novel exactly set during the movement of the Zealots, where one can read it and see exactly how the movement was formed and how it affected people's lives. Now, in 1354, we have the capture of Gallipoli by the Ottomans, which in a way kicks off the Ottoman expansion in the Balkans. Here you can see again a miniature from an old manuscript of the Ottoman, from Ottoman soldiers. And between 1383 and 1387, during Manuel Paleologos' rule of Thessalonica, who eventually became emperor and ruled between 1391 and 1425, the Ottoman Sultan Murad I laid a lengthy siege against the city. Let me remind you that Manuel II Paleologos was the first and only Byzantine emperor to visit King Henry IV of England in London in December 1400. Here you can see Manuel Paleologos and Henry IV. And the source is St. Albans Chronicle. Maybe Henry can correct me on that. I hope I'm pointing towards the right source. And in 1387, we have the surrender of Thessaloniki to the Ottomans. In 1391, John V Palaiologos dies, and Thessalonica enjoys complete autonomy in exchange for payment of the famous Haraj Paul tax. In general, I would say the overall estimate is that Thessaloniki was treated by the Ottomans rather more leniently than the other cities which were utterly destroyed. In 1391, we have the crowning of Manuel II of Palaiologos, and in 1403, Thessalonica falls under full Ottoman control. However, Manuel II of Palaiologos, after John Palaiologos dies, escapes from Ottoman custody, returns to Constantinople in order to succeed his father. And of course, this makes Bayezid, here is Bayezid, as you can see him, very angry, and leads him to storm and capture Thessalonica after a brief resistance. Now Thessalonica, during its submission to the Ottoman, is under full Ottoman rule, and the Christian population and the church population retains most of their possessions. And of course, the city retains its institutions. Unfortunately, there is a struggle between the Ottomans about who is going to succeed Bayezid. This era is called Ottoman Interregnum. And Manuel II decides to side with Suleiman, which is Bayezid's the first eldest son, and secures the return of Thessalonica, part of its hinterland, the return of Chalkidica Peninsula, and of course the coastal region between Strymon and Thrace and Pinios, which is a river in Thessaly. And actually this zone is the most fertile plain in the whole Greece. In 1403 until 1408, Thessalonica is entrusted to John VII Palaiologos, and John Palaiologos governs the city. Between 1408 and 1423, Thessaloniki changes hands, and the despot Andronikos Palaiologos governs Thessalonica. In the meanwhile, it experiences several attacks by Ottoman pretenders. As I told you, we are in the era of the Ottoman Interregnum, for example, from Musa Celebi in 1412 and Mustafa Celebi in 1416. However, the city endures these attacks. Andronikos Palaiologos, unfortunately, makes what we may call the killer mistake. He entrusts the city or transfers the city administration to the Venetians. And the local population expects the Venetians to roll out an effective defensive plan for Thessalonica. Unfortunately, the Venetians were not as effective as expected, and the city on 29th of March 1430 falls in the hands of Murad II. And how we know this? Because this sack, the last one, the complete one, is documented by an otherwise unknown person, John Anagnostis, who was a very meticulous historian, because he gives us very important information about why and how the city fell to the Ottomans. I would like to draw your attention to this inscription. This inscription is on the columns of Achiropeitos Church in the city center of Thessaloniki. It is written, of course, in the Ottoman script, and here you can see the translation, like Fetihi Sultan Murad Khan, Sehri Selanik, Sene, and it refers to the Ottoman, the Arab chronology, 833, which corresponds to 1430 AD. A Hieropytos church was, in a way, Murat turned it into a jami, the Eskijuma jami. However, people who know about Ottoman scripts inform me that probably from the way the letters are written, this must be a much later addition. Now, in 1403 and 1423, Thessalonica experienced a period of relative peace and prosperity. As I mentioned earlier, after 1413, the Ottoman pressure on Thessalonica grew. In 423, the growing Ottoman pressure on Thessalonica led despot Andronikos Palaiologos to cede the city to the Republic of Venice. But unfortunately, this led to the conquest of the city by the Ottomans, because the Venetians fell short of both Andronikos Palaiologos and the population's expectation. Now, let me introduce you to some important homines literati in terms of cultural life of Thessalonica. First of all, we have Leo the mathematician, a famous philosopher, and perhaps he was one of the first humanists. He was the person who introduced algebra in the Hellenic world, and his focus point was philosophy. Of course, we have the three formidable philologists. We have Eustathius of the Archbishop of Thessalonica, the Thomas the Magister, Demetrius Triclinius, and of course we have the famous theologians Gregory Palamas, who was the head of Hesychast, and Nicholas Kavasilas, another mystic theologian who in a way was against Gregory Palamas. And we have two major people who wrote and compiled legal texts and codes. One of them is Matthew Blastaris, and the other is Constantine Harmenopoulos. Harmenopoulos is very famous because he compiled a 6-book abbreviation of the Justinian law and the civic law. This law was used during the Ottoman rule, and also Constantine Harmenopoulos' 6 hexabiblon, this is the title of his work, was used by the liberated Greek state after, of course, 1830, in order, to be used as a law and as a free state. Here again, we have, as you see, I have singled out the focus points of these unique people. And of course, we have other important persons who either stayed in Thessaloniki briefly or in a way they were intermingled with its cultural life. We have Theodore of Studion, who was a supporter of, he was an iconophile, he was entangled in in iconoclasm, and he was exiled in Thessaloniki in 18th century AD. I have added here the famous icon, which is kept in British Museum, which is it is dated much later, around 14th century, and it is kept in the British Museum. And here you can see Theodore Stoudidis holding an icon of Christ. If you go to the British Museum, you might be able to see it. And of course, farmers' law or leges rusticae were drawn up by Justinian II in Thessalonica in autumn 688 AD. Some information about Leo the mathematician. He was a representative of 9th century humanism. He was a student of Michael Psellos. He was collector of manuscripts. He introduced algebra in the Hellenic world. According to Paul Lemerle, he was the first European humanist, and of course he was a teacher of Kirill and Methodius. Eustathius of Thessalonica, again, a person of formidable erudition. He wrote commentaries on Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, which are still used. Here you can see one of the manuscripts. A commentary on Pindar, commentary on Dionysius Periegetes, and orations. Thessaloniki during the 13th century turned into a study center of Greek literature. We have people like John Pediasmos or Pediasimos, Thomas Magister, Demetrius Triclinius, who commentated, edited tragic poets like Aristotle, like Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, philosophers like Aristotle, Synesius, and also Thomas Magister produced an edition of Pindar with scholia, with commentary. Demetrius Triclinius acted as an editor and commentator of Greek poets, while John Pediasmos wrote scholia on Hesiod, Theocritus, and Aristotle. And of course, we have in a way the overshadowing presence of Gregory Palamas, who lived between 1296 and 1359. Gregory Palamas was a Byzantine theologian and an Eastern Orthodox cleric. He was the defender of Hesychast movement and spirituality. He served as a metropolitan of Thessalonica in 1347 onwards, and he was the teacher and supporter of what we know as mental prayer, or alias known as the prayer of the heart, in Greek noera prosευχή. A less known event in Gregory Palamas' life is that while he was traveling on a ship, he was abducted by pirates and was ultimately ended up to Orhan, the son of Osman Bey, the person who founded the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman family and the Ottoman Empire. And Orhan set up a debate between Gregory and some Muslim people in order to understand what Orthodoxy is all about. Now, after the Ottoman conquest, or somehow some years before, we have two intellectuals who originated from Thessalonica. The one is Theodore Gaza, or Theodore Gazis, who was born in Thessaloniki in 1398 and died in Calabria in southern Italy in 1475. And here you can see Theodore Gaza depicted in Sandro Botticelli's The Adoration of Magi. And I would like to conclude my presentation with another famous person, which is who is Andronikos Kallistos. The two people were related because Andronikos was a cousin of Theodore Gaza, who was born in Thessalonica, traveled to Italy, of course, to escape the Ottoman rule, and ended up dying in London in 1476. So this was my overall overview of Thessaloniki and historical setting, and thank you very much. I will pass on to my next colleague.
Hello, hello, hello. I will just, maybe a good bridge here is, you mentioned Elton Palace, which I've got to say is probably London's sole Byzantine attraction that's outside a museum. It's gorgeous. It is where Henry IV met Manuel II. There's not really much left other than the hall they met in, but there's a lot of gorgeous Art Deco stuff, riffing on Byzantine themes, lots of aesthetics like, you know, golden ground bathrooms and things like that. And it's literally just outside London, so you're really being lazy if you're not going. So, to get on with my talk is on Thessaloniki in a sea of Slavs, from 533 to 904. The speech will have two halves. The first, I'll be honest with you, is really just academic justification for being really annoyed with the German historian, which some of you might know, some of you might not, is called Jakob Philipp Fallmeyer. Now, he's quite famous for kind of casting the Hellenic genius in purely racial terms. The second half of the speech will be on seeing Thessaloniki as a key node in the survival of the Byzantine West, as in the European half of the Byzantine Empire. I mean, it did suffer 4 imperial expeditions in the course of just 120 years. So let's start with Fallmeyer. I mean, really I'm touching on him because for me it gets to the nitty-gritty, which is the whats, the hows, the whys and the whens of the Slavic occupation of pretty much the whole of the Balkans. And I say that in the sense that it kind of happens out of nowhere. For me, it's quite interesting because I think you could pretty much say it's only 2 generations. You get Slavs going from not even mentioned to Slavs owning almost a third of an empire. And I think Fallmeyer kind of said the quiet bit of the Western conscience out loud when he said the Greeks were a bunch of Albanians, Slavs, and Turks. That is basically, Hellas, Greece, is essentially an Ottoman dustbin rather than the pure font of the Renaissance imagination. Yes, Fallmeyer, if any of you know him, is the ultimate nemesis of the Phil-Hellenes. He wrote in his History of the Morea in 1830 that not this, and I'm quoting, these are not my words, not the slightest drop of undiluted Hellenic blood flows in the veins of the Christian population of present-day Greece. So, what do we have here? We have, not only were the Greeks not Orthodox, of course they're schismatics, thanks to the Great Schism, they are not only not Roman, don't forget they're Greeks, the Hellenes. They are also now, in this endless cascade of demotions, essentially not even Greeks. So these are imposters on every possible level. Now, you might think like me, that that's a little rich coming from a citizen of Germania, which has pretty much produced only men who have ended the Western Roman Empire, well, that's the 5th century. Then they pressed the filioque upon the Pope, a little bit later. They sacked Constantinople in 1204. They invented Protestantism in the 16th century. And then they promoted the racialization of nations in the 20th. But that's enough of my Twitter feed. It's time to get serious. Ultimately, Fallmeyer could get away with this bunkum because there is a cloud of mystery that envelopes that obscure period in the Balkan history that stands roughly between the failed attempts of Justinian to conquer the West, reconquer the West, shall we say, a kind of reconquista, and essentially Justinian II's Balkan campaign, which comes around 688. Thankfully, and I'm kind of trying to tie in Thessalonica here, is essentially one of the only accounts that actually provides any flesh on the bones of the Slav question is St. Demetrius' Miracles, the Miraculous Sancti Demetri in Latin, and that kind of fleshes stuff out. Let's go through some sources to begin with. Sorry, I don't have any beautiful slides. You have to listen to my gorgeous, mellifluous voice. But essentially, I'm going to sift through some sources, and you'll just see how bare bones this stuff is, because then we actually get to Demetrius' Miracles, and they're a lifesaver. So essentially, we first come across the Slavs as background fodder to Procopius and Jordanes. They do provide some important details. One is the general Germanus intercepts some Slavs in 518. That's pretty much the first thing we hear of them, 518. So kind of mental note there, 518. The Magister Militum in Thrace, Halbudius, is actually fights the Slavs. He's known as super brave. Procopius bangs on about how brave he is. None of the valor of the Roman Empire can match Halbudius because essentially he crossed the Danube to go and take the fight to the Slavs. But he doesn't do so very, very long. He pretty much does some for 3 years, and then he dies doing so. Menander the Guardsman's next. I mean, he actually puts down the Slavs. He just says they're a bunch of Avar lackeys, which is kind of true, to be honest, but it kind of develops a lot more. John of Ephesus talks about Slavic raids in the mid-6th century. Actually, some of the most interesting information comes from Western chroniclers, which you probably wouldn't think of. John of Biclar is a Visigoth, of all people, and he provides some, I know he was in Constantinople, but he's also providing some super up-to-date information like Slavs ravaging Illyricum in 576 and 581. He also the Slavs occupy parts of Greece in 579. There's only 2 bits more of information. One's the Strategicon. Some of you might know it. Some people claim the Emperor Maurice wrote it. Most people believe he commissioned it. Actually, that one's a little bit of an interesting text because it claims that the Slavs were a bit like the Indians and that they practiced, Imperial Britain is going, these guys, well, their wives are dying whenever their husbands do in a kind of thuggy practice. Isidore of Seville's the last one. He basically says the whole of Greece is occupied. And I mean, Isidore dies in 636, so pretty much by the reign of Heraclius, we've gone from a few tepid, tiny little raindrop raids to Greece is gone. Now, for Englishmen like myself, it's quite interesting because this is a side note, I'm not going to lie. There's a side note which is quite interesting for me because this guy's winning victories with names like Godwin. Now, Godwin's not a particularly Greek name. It's not even a Latin name. I mean, you can reach for words like Amadeus if you want friend of God, which is just kind of cool in the cosmopolitan sense that you had, he wasn't a general, but he was a fairly senior military official, and he's achieving massive victories against the Slavs in 602. The next thing we hear is from Fredegar. He's in the west of the Slavs, so think of Moravia, bordering on Germany. He's kind of ruling the Slavic Empire under the name Samo. And Columbanus is thinking at the time, roughly 630, thinking, no, a bit earlier. He's going, let's convert these guys. He chickens out. One of his disciples, Amandus, does it. Which brings us to the miracles of St. Demetrius. Now, these are several books. The first one's actually written in 610. And Maria kind of mentioned one of the raids. Well, it was a siege, actually, roughly 5,000 Slavs in 617. Essentially, book 1 boils down to Demetrius is your guy. He's your saint. He's your patron. I'm actually trying to think. There's not really a Constantinopolitan equivalent, maybe like, well, the Mother of God, basically, right? So there's no real Demetrius of Constantinople, which I think is quite cool. So essentially, there's a lot of flesh on the bones here. I'll cut to the chase. Essentially, Demetrius is always on a city wall defending this place. And it's adding really interesting details, like the Slavic king, Pabundius, basically managed to assimilate into becoming a Roman, both costume, he spoke Greek, and yet he was kind of a Roman in the way the Bulgars later became Roman, in the sense that they just wanted to boss the Roman pie. They weren't actually, he wasn't actually interested in the civilizational or Christian element. It was a kind of wig to control people under. And so Demetrius is obviously not a big fan of Pabundius, and there's a great big siege again in 677. An earthquake topples the walls at some point. I mean, Demetrius is full of hijinks. He He's stopping the Slavs with ginormous visions during battle. At one point, I mean, it gets a little bit silly. He's kind of, he's slapping a Slavic craftsman who's had the temerity to build this ginormous siege tower. But it does provide historical knowledge. It's providing things like saying Thessalonica is surrounded by 7 Slavic tribes and things like that. Kind of stuff that is good as source material for historians. But let's just loop back to Pharmariah. Basically, he didn't use all these good sources. He was just a bit lazy as a historian. We've covered all the good evidence for Slavs overrunning parts of Greece, but the one he relied on is known as the Chronicle of Monovasia, and that's the one he bases all his theories on, and that's a bit sad for many reasons. The main one is the only manuscript of this chronicle that contains the information he claims it does. It's just one of them, and it's the last one. It's actually in a monastery in Athos called Ivron, the Georgian one. And basically, it's the last one to be written. It probably contains a lot of interpolation because the other ones use Alexandrian dating, which is an older form of dating to the Byzantine one. Essentially, you date them from different years. One's 5509, the other one's 54 or something. I always forget which. But basically, it's later. And the chronicle, on top of all that, is written in the late 10th century. So that's a long time from when the Slavs start attacking in 518. We're talking a chronicle written almost 5 centuries later. Oh, and the final point is it was written as a religious text, a kind of backstory for the metropolitan see of Patras. It's basically religious bunkum. So to just conclude on Pharmariah, he may be right, he may be wrong, but don't lean on texts that are late and incorrect. You know, I'm kind of pleading the case here for doing good history, not the lazy Germanic sort. Which leads me perfectly to segue on to part 2 of this, which is rescuing victory from the jaws of defeat, the Byzantine resurgence between 657 and 904. Now, according to Theophanes, Constans II, in looking to balance his poor military record against the Arabs, basically assaults the Slavs in the mid-7th century. Now, this is kind of interesting just because he doesn't really manage to drive the Slavs away. He just kind of subjugates them to a kind of, at the very least, notional imperial authority. About 3 decades later, Justinian II manages the same thing. If anything, he improves it by joining up the land routes. But, you mentioned that gorgeous valley, the most productive bit of the Strymon. He basically connects all the communication routes to Constantinople again. But the perennial dilemma here is essentially that both Romans and Bulgars to the north are strong minorities. Nassim Taleb uses this beautiful phrase, intolerant minorities, which I think applies here because they basically won't leave the Slavs alone. They want to boss the Slavs around because Slavs mean taxes. And the Slavs are kind of like, where do we get any money from? And they go to, lots of them turn to piracy, actually. Imbros suffers a lot, so does Samothraki. I mean, lots of these places basically are denuded of both property, goods, and people into slavery a lot of the time. There's even a historical raid on Crete in 623. Not many people know about that one. And all of this just kind of chaos means Constantine V is forced to go on a massive campaign in the mid-8th century. Then, finally, Irene sends a general, and again, reasserting hard power where soft power has failed. Which leads me to the conclusion, which is, why has Thessalonica been the focus of at least 4 major Byzantine expeditions between 657 and 783? It seems to be, the long and short of it is that these military exertions are just, I guess they're going against the demographic grain. You're just kind of reasserting yourself, but failing to cow them into submission for anything more than a single generation. Basically, Romanization is going to be slow if you don't have that many Romans doing the Romanizing. And none of that really changes until 810, when Nicephorus starts to kind of plug into that dynamic, and he just engages in a load of population exchanges, to use the 20th century term. It's just basically shunting people left, right, and center in the empire. And it was very successful because, I think, Maria, you mentioned him, John Kameniates was essentially the chronicler of the 904 siege, and one of his biggest praises for this Byzantine policy was, by 904, the Slavs were fighting for the Eastern Romans, not the other way around. Well,
I would like to thank first the organizers, the Macedonian Society, and Panos Dafas for hosting me extremely well in London, and thank you all for attending tonight. Thanks to my colleagues for the wonderful talks they have presented. I'm going to talk about Thessaloniki in the 14th century. Thessaloniki is a very beautiful place, but always was second best somehow. You know, we talk about Constantinople as the queen city, and Thessaloniki was the co-queen, Symvasilevousa. But actually, in the 14th century, there's this sense that Thessaloniki gains in importance. You know, Orestes Tafrali, who wrote a book on Thessaloniki and its history in the early 20th century, he wrote a book on Thessaloniki's history, and then a book on Thessaloniki's history in the 14th century. So that means that there is a lot to say about Thessaloniki in the 14th century. But actually, although we know a lot, we know not everything. I'm going to focus on this church called Prophetis Elias. Here you've got a map of Thessaloniki's monuments, you know, the walls and all the other monuments inside the city. And this church I'm going to talk about, the Prophetis Elias, as we know it, we don't know the original dedication. Prophetis Elias is a misnomer. It still occupies a very prominent place in Thessaloniki's topography. This is Agios Dimitrios, St. Dimitrios Church. This is the Roman Forum. And actually, when Ernest Brar redrew Thessaloniki after the Great Fire of 1917, he made this gesture, the Aristotelus street, which is now one of the most beautiful streets in Thessaloniki. And it would have ended up in Prophetis Elias if it wasn't for the excavation that revealed the forum and cancelled the construction of Aristotelus above the Roman Forum. But this means that it was a focus in the center of the city, this prominent place. And actually, it is one of the most beautiful and greatest in architectural terms of the late Byzantine churches, not just in Thessaloniki, but everywhere. I mean, it is a beautiful church, much bigger and much more monumental than any other in Constantinople, in Mistras, in Arta, in all the places where there are late Byzantine monuments. So let's start from this, the fact that it is the most beautiful and the most monumental. So we like to connect it, we would like to connect it, I would like to connect it to imperial patronage. And that is the first thing that we have to seek when we seek its identity. It is called Prophetis Elias because when two Englishmen, Texier and Palan, came to Thessaloniki to study Byzantine architecture, heard that it was called Seraili Jami, and thought that this Seraili meant Prophetis Elias. But actually it meant that it was the Jami because it was converted to a mosque. As you see here, it's minaret, now destroyed. It was connected to a palatial residence, a serai. And I'm thankful to one of my colleagues in the University of Thessaloniki who found a text describing Thessaloniki in the 16th century, and the commentator says that it was called Seraili Jami because there was the palace of the infidels, not the palace of the early Ottoman administration, which means that somewhere near Prophetis Elias Church there was a late Byzantine palace. So that is the second thing to keep in mind, and that actually corresponds to the topography of the church. The problem, as I already said, is that we do not know its original dedication. So we will focus on some of its peculiarities and try to address the whereabouts of its probably imperial patron and also its dedication. The church, here you have the plan, here is the plan before its restoration. It shows that it is a monastic Catholicon, and actually one that follows the architecture of the Catholica of Mount Athos. And not only just follows, but it is an exact copy of the Catholica of Mount Athos, the main churches of the monasteries in Mount Athos, and not only that, it is the earliest Athonite Catholicon outside of Mount Athos that has survived. Probably it was the first instance of an Athonite-type Catholicon outside of Mount Athos. So there is a strong connection also with Mount Athos behind this church that I would like also to explore. Here you have the Lavra Catholicon, the Catholicon of the Lavra Monastery, which is thought to be the earliest one. There is some debate about which one is the earliest, if it is the Iviron or if it is the Great Lavra Catholicon. But I think you can see the similarity in the layout of the plan. And we'll talk about it a little bit later. And the Lavra Catholicon is from the 10th century, as you probably know. Here again, a comparison between Prophetis Elias and the Great Lavra Catholicon to show the similarity in the layout of the plan. And this is the Vatopedi Catholicon, also of the same type as you see here in its plan. And one of the late Byzantine, because Vatopedi is also 10th to 11th century, one of the late Byzantine Catholica of Mount Athos is the Hilandar Catholicon. Here you have the plan. Unfortunately, in this depiction with the apse on the left, it should be on the right. Anyway, so what are the main characteristics of an Athonite Catholico? It has two huge apses, one to the north, the other to the south. It has a liti instead of a small narthex. It is a special unit found in all the monastic Catholica of Mount Athos. Also, it has small chapels, domed chapels, and also an ambulatory encircling the western part of the church. And actually, this is the Catholicon of Koutouloumous in Mount Athos, which I think is the closest example of the type of architecture applied to Prophetis Elias in Thessaloniki, but enough with the Athonite connection, I think you get the picture. So, why an Athonite Catholico in Thessaloniki? Because the rest of the Paleologan, this is a good question, because the rest of the Paleologan churches in Thessaloniki have nothing to do with Athonite architecture. These are the typical layouts of the late Byzantine, the major late Byzantine churches in Thessaloniki. This is Agios Saint Panteleimon. We don't know the original dedication. This is the so-called Saints Apostoli, actually the Catholicon of a monastery founded by Patriarch Niphon in Thessaloniki. This is Agia Ekaterini, Saint Catherine, also not dedicated originally to Saint Catherine. And this is the Vlatadon Catholico, which is the only one we have its original dedication. So, it does not resemble any other of the churches in Thessaloniki, so its patron, Prophetis Elias' patron, chose that layout in order to say something. That is my feeling about explaining why he or she chose this layout. Another specific A special feature of Prophetess Elias is this VIP balcony. It's very beautiful. Now it's a little bit smaller, the opening, than its original form. This VIP balcony overlooking the naos, a gallery above the liti, which is very advantageous. If you stand there, you have a very good view of what is happening inside the church. This is a feature of Constantinopolitan architecture. We don't have any other late Byzantine church in Thessaloniki having a gallery like this, but we find, and this is my specialty, because I follow women and the way they sponsored architecture, and I think that we have Katholika, monastery churches in Constantinople, founded by women, sponsored by women, who used these galleries as a VIP balcony in order to have a good view of what was happening inside the church. This is the Pantepoptis Church, sponsored by Anna Dalasini. She was the mother of Alexius I Komnenos. This is the Catholiko, actually the church complex of the Pantocrator Monastery, again in Constantinople, founded not by John II, but by his wife Irini Komnini from Hungary in the early 12th century. All three churches share a gallery running along their western part, giving great views in all three churches. And last but not least, Theodora, the wife of Michael VIII Palaiologos in the late 13th century, refounded the monastery of Livos, which already had a balcony, a very nice balcony overlooking the main naos in its old church. And another small church with a VIP balcony founded by Theodoros Tarchaniotis' widow. It is this small chapel, not very small, but small to the church, comparing to the church it is attached to, with this very nice balcony overviewing the main church. So what do we get from this? That this was a female thing. And how we know that? We have this letter sent by Athanasios the Patriarch to Andronikos II Palaiologos. He sends a letter for a completely different reason. I'm not going to give you any more details, but at some point he complains, the Patriarch, about women going into these galleries in churches in Constantinople, and he's talking here specifically for Saint Sophia, for Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, and he says that he objects to this thing, women going up to the galleries to attend the liturgy, because he says they don't go there out of piety, they go to show off and to exclude themselves from the rest of the congregation, and also, he says, to put themselves above everyone else, and especially above the liturgy itself. So he's really angry about it. Can you get the picture? Yeah. But consider now that if a lady wants to do that, if she sponsors a church, a monastic church, she can do whatever she wants to, and do not be condemned by any patriarch who objects to that. So, when we talk about Prophetess Elias, we have two very specific features. It is, I think it is fairly, we are fairly certain to say that this is an imperial foundation, first. Second, it has a connection to Mount Athos. And second, it has a connection to some lady. The perfect candidate is Anna of Savoy for constructing this church. So let me explain about Anna of Savoy, or Anna Palaiologina, who was a very famous empress residing in Thessaloniki in the middle of the 14th century. In an act by her grandson, Manuel II Palaiologos, we get a picture that she became a nun in a monastery that probably she founded, and she gave to this monastery in Thessaloniki, the monastery of Saint Sanargiri, she donated a palatial residence called Avli to Sirgi. It was the palace of some guy who was called Sergi. And we know from the details of this act of Manuel II that this Sirgi, whose residence was donated by Anna of Savoy to the monastery of Anargiri, was actually a guy named Guy de Lusignan. He was half Cypriot French, half Armenian, and he came to Thessaloniki at some point. He had a family there. He had a daughter called Isabel Lusignan, and she was married to the son of John Katakouzinos. I know I'm throwing you a lot of names here, but if you know some of the Byzantine history, probably you can follow. And all of these were actually the political opponents of Anna of Savoy. That is the main thing to have in mind here. So Anna of Savoy confiscated this palatial residence of Guy de Lusignan in Thessaloniki and donated it to a monastery. Anna, although coming from North Italy, actually she became Orthodox. We know that because her praise, her commemoration in what is called the Synodicon of Orthodoxy, it is a manuscript in Mount Athos in the Protaton kept, where are the commemorations of all the emperors and all the patriarchs and other people. Her commemoration is 5 lines and is amazing. They call her Saint and Agia, and she is praised because she was instrumental in the fight between the Hesychasts and the anti-Hesychasts. It's a huge thing. I think that Dr. Xanthou told us a lot about this fight, but praised by the Athonite monks because she was a champion of orthodoxy with the same commemoration that is used for John Katakouzinos, who actually was her political adversary. So Anna was a saintly lady for the Athonites, and actually she was instrumental in establishing Gregory Palamas as Thessaloniki's metropolitan, because, as Dr. Xanthou said, Thessalonians didn't like the rich people, that is the zealot controversy, but in this category of rich people were also the monasteries of Mount Athos, because they were huge landowners inside Thessaloniki, and the people of Thessaloniki didn't like that. So they thought that Palamas, because he was an abbot of Great Lavra, as a metropolitan would be in favor of the privileges that the monasteries had in Thessaloniki. So they opposed to his establishment as a metropolitan, and only Anna, who was very favorably viewed by Thessalonians, was able to establish him in Thessaloniki as metropolitan. And apparently her role in that is somehow depicted in the fact that she chose to construct a church that resembles Athonite Catholica, and in this way establish a new era in the relationship between Mount Athos and Thessaloniki. And actually this, I think, comes out on the rest of the sources, that the relationship between Thessaloniki and Mount Athos begins favorably only after the establishment of Gregory of Palamas. And so monks came and went from Thessaloniki to Mount Athos and visited Anna. Here I have an excerpt from one of the manuscripts. I don't remember the Dochiariou. I'm sorry, I have it there. From the Acts of Dochiariou Monastery, some monks went and visited her in her God-guarded palace. When she was done, to discuss an important case. This important case has to do with some real estate problems that they had in Thessaloniki. But in 1361, Anna was already a nun, and this God-guarded palace, I think, is the palatial residence that she used while being a nun in the monastery of Anargiri. Actually, this palace, originally belonging to Sergi, to Guy de Lusignan, probably was a very valuable possession because her daughter didn't forget, his daughter, Isabel de Lusignan in Mistras, didn't forget about it. In the continuation of the act that I showed you before of Manuel II, when Manuel, before going to Venice to free his father, went to Mistras to collect money for this expedition, Isabel asked for her dowry back, because it was her dowry after all, this palatial residence in Thessaloniki, and Manuel had to give it back to her. So apparently it wasn't just a small house, it was something big that mattered to this lady in Mistras, although she was there, mattered this valuable real estate in Thessaloniki, so she asked for it back. So coming back to Prophetess Elias, a prominent place in the Ottoman sources called near the Palace of the Infidels, an important church, judging by its position and also by its size and monumentality, close to a palatial residence, as we have seen. And when we say palatial residence, if you want to have a view of what it might be in late Byzantium, this is the Tekfur Sarai, one of the lesser palaces in Constantinople. So don't expect something very spectacular. It might be just a 3 levels structure like this. So somewhere around there, but unfortunately not surviving today. And 2 small details that probably reflect that this theory has lots of grounds to it. First, there is a coin, you know, that is another thing about Anna of Savoy. She minted coins in Thessaloniki, and that is very important because the mint of Thessaloniki ceased to operate until the 14th century. It ceased to operate around the 8th century or the 7th century. It's a huge debate. But for sure, it started working again in the 14th century. And there are coins of Anna of Savoy, either alone or with her husband or with her son. But there are some coins where she is depicted alone, and these coins have been found even in Ceres, which means that they circulated and they were used for exchanges and commerce. So I don't have the picture because it has not been published, but I have the description. In the one side, there is a full-length figure of the Empress. This is Anna of Savoy, I tell you. And on the other side, 2 standing Nimbate figures with halo, which I think might be the Anargiri. So she used the Anargiri of the convent that she introduced in Thessaloniki. And the other coin I have, of course, thankfully, and this is Anna with the letters of the Paleologan dynasty, holding this structure. Usually this structure is the walled city, and it might be Thessaloniki. But even Cécile Morisson, the expert on coins, says that this specific structure looks like a specific building. She doesn't know, Cécile Morisson doesn't know anything about the structures in Thessaloniki. She says it might be Saint Demetrius. No, that is not Saint Demetrius. These 3, on the western part, 3 domes of Prophetess Elias correspond to this 3-dome structure of this coin and the structure that is held by Anna of Savoy. We will never be sure. That's the unhappy part of this talk. Whether this is the Catholicon of St. Sanargiri, sponsored by Anna of Savoy, unfortunately, but I hope that at some point there is some inscription or some other detail that will lend more substance to this theory. Like Professor Matsoukas, I'm on the verge of writing a novel about all these things, like he did for Zilotica, because I think the question of what women did is a fantastic one in the force of rolling the history. So thank you very much for your patience, and I'm open to any questions you might have regarding this theory. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think this one's probably for Professor Xanthou. The slides we saw before the talk, you were showing the east of the city and the circus, and outside that some triangular projecting bastions. I know there are similar ones on the western side of the city because last time I visited, that was right where my hotel was. But I've never seen anything similar in Roman or Byzantine fortification anywhere else. Do you know if those triangular bastions are unique to Thessalonica, or do you know of any other examples?
Well, although I'm not an expert in architecture, I know there are some, perhaps Professor Tantsis, who is an architect, might know better about the Byzantine walls. I can refer you to two monographs. The one is by George Gounaris, The Byzantine Walls of Thessalonica, and Velenis also, both Georges. George Gounaris and George Velenis, who wrote about the Byzantine walls. So I would like to refer to Professor Tantsis because he knows Byzantine walls better.
No, and the only thing I can offer is that you are right for asking this because they are unique, the triangular, but they are in the eastern part of the walls, there are very few. They are much more in the western part, and actually they are the ones that have, you know, what is considered to be the marble seating of the hippodrome on their lower part, if you remember this detail. They have marble parts in their base, and this is considered to be the seating of the hippodrome. And this is a huge question about Thessaloniki, because we tend to think that the eastern and western walls were constructed in the same period, which I think is a huge mistake, but don't worry about that. Because if they used the seating of the hippodrome, why carry it all the way to the western part and not use it in the eastern part, if it has to do with the Theodosius massacre and the siege of chariot racing in the hippodrome and all this question, which is, you know, it's huge for Thessaloniki. So you might want to, but it is in Greek, I don't know, you read Greek? No, yeah. Unfortunately, the bibliography is mostly in Greek, so it won't help you a lot, I'm sorry.
One thing I would like to add is that indeed the Thessalonica, well, if you just browse the bibliography about Thessalonica, you will see that there are many good monographs, unfortunately written most in Greek. Usually British researchers tend to focus either in Istanbul, in Rome, in what's the other, the church, Ravenna, Ravenna, and so on. So Thessaloniki, and since I taught in the UK universities, so far in modern British scholarship, I haven't met anyone focusing on Thessalonica, and especially either on architecture, on story. And believe me, Thessaloniki, whether you believe it or not, is very closely related to British history in many, many ways. So that was my concluding part.
This cruel epitaph, but it's true. Yes. Just one more, I think. I've got it.
It was mentioned that the Venetians were given, for a period of time, the role of administrating the city. What was the story kind of behind that? Why did that end up
Yes,
developing?
well, they thought, the Byzantines thought that, first of all, the Venetians would fight for the city because they needed a port in North Aegean. Unfortunately, this proved to be a miscalculation. Because the Venetians didn't, I mean, if they needed this port, they would have fought for it. For example, they would have supported the city walls. They would do some fortification works, which, okay, some they did, but they didn't do enough. So the Venetians were focused in other parts of the world, and so they didn't want to fight for Thessaloniki as much as, for example, other places and other ports. And they might also thought that this battle is lost, and maybe they could also make later on some kind of pact with the Ottomans in the long run. Okay, not when the city was conquered, but definitely the Venetians. Thessaloniki was given to the Venetians, was entrusted to the Venetians in order to be fortified and to be supported and to be defended as a port. But the Venetians were engaged they were not in their A list.
They liked trade and Aegean Empire, but they didn't like overheads.
Exactly.
Well, if I may.
Yeah.
I'm sorry now to interrupt, but if I may, it's the same situation in the Peloponnese. The Byzantines in the Peloponnese tried to persuade the Venetians to help with defending the Peloponnese against the Turks, but the Venetians were happy just to have Methoni and Monevasia and a little bit of Corinth. They didn't want to have the whole area to themselves. So as long as the Ottomans didn't interfere with this outpost, they didn't care. The whole situation got, yeah. But the Byzantines thought, you know, that Venice would help them. They didn't. So that was the miscalculation.
Exactly. And also the Venetians would probably interested, as Professor Tantsis mentioned, in the trade in the main Mediterranean. The route, for example, between Sicily, Malta, Kythera, Cyprus, and of course Istanbul, but Thessaloniki in a way was used as a bottleneck, if we also judge from the recent history, either as a bottleneck against Slavs to come southwards, or in order to connect the hinterland of the Balkans with the sea.
Very good note to end on.
Which in a way also is a fact also for today.
A wine reception will follow at the back of the room, so I think we can continue the conversation and Q&A back then. So please join me in a big round of applause for our panelists. So thank you very much for this wonderful evening. I would also like to thank our sponsors, the A.G. Leventis Foundation, the HellenicTV for covering the event, and of course Live Media for streaming the event for our online audience. Thank you for attending. Please enjoy the drinks and canapés. Thank you very much.
Μια θαυμάσια λοιπόν εκδήλωση που οργάνωσε ο Σύνδεσμος Μακεδόνων Μεγάλης Βρετανίας. Μόλις τελείωσε τώρα. Πάρα πολύ ενδιαφέρον το θέμα. Ήταν στην αγγλική φυσικά. Πάρα πολλοί κόσμος παρακολούθησε τους ομιλητές. Εμείς έχουμε τώρα τον πρόεδρο του συνδέσμου εδώ, τον κύριο
Παναγιώτης Δάφας.
Παναγιώτης Δάφας. Είστε ο νέος πρόεδρος,
Ναι, ακριβώς.
Ναι. Λοιπόν, θέλουμε έτσι με λίγα λόγια, εν συντομία, να μας πείτε το θέμα το απόψινό και έτσι για να καταλάβουν και οι τηλεθεατές μας, οι οποίοι δεν μπορούν να κατανοήσουν πολύ την αγγλική γλώσσα. Έτσι, πέστε με λίγα λόγια.
Βασικά το θέμα ήταν γενικά γύρω από τη Θεσσαλονίκη στην εποχή του Βυζαντίου. Το πάνελ των ομιλητών κάλυψε διάφορες πτυχές. Ξεκίνησε η κυρία Μαρία Xanthou με μια ιστορική αναδρομή, παρουσιάζοντας τα κύρια, ας πούμε, milestones ή κάποιες κύριες συγκυρίες από την ιστορία του Βυζαντίου στη Θεσσαλονίκη, μια ιστορική αναδρομή και επίσης ανέφερε τις μεγαλύτερες σπουδαίες προσωπικότητες που το Βυζάντιο ανέδειξε εκείνα τα χρόνια στη Θεσσαλονίκη. Ο Χένρι Φίλιπς έκανε ουσιαστικά, έδωσε μια πτυχή διαφορετική αναλύοντας κάποια ιστορικά ντοκουμέντα και από ιστορικούς που ουσιαστικά ήθελαν να παρουσιάσουν ουσιαστικά τον πληθυσμό που ζούσε στο Βυζάντιο ως ένα συνοθήλευμα εθνών και χωρίς κάποια καθαρή, ας πούμε, εθνική ταυτότητα ακριβώς. Βέβαια έδωσε τις δικές του εκδοχές και τους λόγους γιατί αυτή ήταν μια πολύ μονόπλευρη ουσιαστικά θεώρηση της τότε συγκυρίας. Επίσης αναφέρθηκε στους πώς οι Σλάβοι ουσιαστικά εκείνη την περίοδο τι σχέσεις είχαν με το Βυζάντιο και γενικά με την Ανατολική Ρωμυλία, ας το πούμε έτσι. Και τέλος ο καθηγητής του Αριστοτελείου Πανεπιστημίου, ο κύριος Τάντσης, έδωσε μια εξαιρετική ομιλία για την αρχιτεκτονική και την ιστορία των βυζαντινών εκκλησιών στην Θεσσαλονίκη. Με αρχική και focal point, ας πούμε, σημείο με επίκεντρο τον ναό του προφήτη Ηλία, που ήταν και η αρχή, το τέλος του της Αριστοτέλου και ήταν συνδεδεμένος θεωρητικά αυτός ο ναός με βάση τα ιστορικά δεδομένα που πιστεύετε με κάποιο παλάτι βυζαντινό εκείνη την εποχή.
Μάλιστα. Τώρα, να πάμε λίγο στο σύνδεσμο και πάλι. Ιδρύθηκε πριν από αρκετά χρόνια και είναι ένας σύνδεσμος με μεγάλη δραστηριότητα, έτσι.
Βεβαίως, ιδρύθηκε το 1989 εδώ στο Λονδίνο από την ελληνική κοινότητα με καταγωγή τη Μακεδονία. Ο σκοπός του συλλόγου ουσιαστικά είναι η προώθηση της κουλτούρας, της τέχνης και της ιστορίας, της ελληνικής ιστορίας της Μακεδονίας. Συνήθως οργανώνουμε 2-3 εκδηλώσεις το χρόνο. Τα τελευταία 2 χρόνια λόγω του COVID κάναμε διαδικτυακά τις εκδηλώσεις μας, αλλά το κοινό θα μπορεί να επισκεφτεί το website μας στο www.macedonia.org.uk και να παρακολουθήσει όλες τις εκδηλώσεις που είναι μαγνητοσκοπημένες και μάλιστα το HellenicTV καλύπτει εδώ και χρόνια ουσιαστικά τις εκδηλώσεις μας. Φέτος ήταν η πρώτη εκδήλωση που κάναμε στο Ελληνικό Κέντρο μετά από 2 χρόνια και είμαστε ενθουσιασμένοι βασικά με το κοινό που είχαμε και τον αριθμό των ατόμων που παρακολούθησαν την εκδήλωση.
Μάλιστα. Το μελλοντικό πρόγραμμα, έχετε κάτι το οποίο μπορείτε να μας ανακοινώσετε?
Βεβαίως, ενώ δεν έχουμε καθορίσει τελικές λεπτομέρειες, η Vicky Price μαζί με ένα πάνελ ουσιαστικά θα μιλήσει για τις συνεχιζόμενες κρίσεις μετά το Brexit, η κρίση, the cost of living crisis και η ζωή στη Μεγάλη Βρετανία και στην Ευρώπη γενικότερα.
Μάλιστα. Έχει πάρα πολλούς εκ Μακεδονίας εδώ, ζουν αρκετοί στη Μεγάλη Βρετανία, στο Ηνωμένο Βασίλειο ή...
Είναι δύσκολο να πει κάποιος, να δώσει κάποιο έτσι αριθμό με βεβαιότητα, γιατί ο κόσμος έρχεται σίγουρα. Με την οικονομική κρίση είχαμε δει έναν μεγάλο αριθμό ανθρώπων να ήρθαν στην Μεγάλη Βρετανία και έμειναν. Βέβαια, βλέπουμε τώρα ο κόσμος ξεκινάει και γυρίζει πίσω στην Ελλάδα. Επομένως, θα έλεγα ότι τα τελευταία χρόνια έχει λιγοστέψει το κοινό μας. Αλλά αυτό είναι και καλό έτσι.
Ναι. Έχετε και άλλες συναντήσεις με τα μέλη σας κοινωνικού περιεχομένου ή...
Βεβαίως, συνήθως κάνουμε μία εκδήλωση, κάποιο τραπέζι χριστουγεννιάτικο. Βέβαια τα τελευταία 2 χρόνια δεν μπορέσαμε να κάνουμε κάτι. Ίσως φέτος το οργανώσουμε, αν όχι το χριστουγεννιάτικο καθιερωμένο Christmas Ball, ίσως κάποια έξοδο σε κάποιο εστιατόριο. Και έχουμε την καθιερωμένη κοπή βασιλόπιτας επίσης κάθε χρόνο, συνήθως Ιανουάριο ή αρχές Φεβρουαρίου, στην κρύπτη της Αγίας Σοφίας γίνεται αυτή η εκδήλωση.
Μιλήσατε για το website. Θέλετε να μας δώσετε τη διεύθυνση, αν κάποιοι ενδιαφέρονται να μπουν?
Είναι macedonia.org.uk.
Πολύ ωραία. Σας ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ για αυτή την ιδιαίτερη διάλεξη την απόψινή. Πολύ κατατοπιστική και μάθαμε αρκετά πράγματα. Και σας ευχόμαστε κάθε επιτυχία στις προσπάθειες.
Σας ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ και ευχαριστούμε για την κάλυψη σήμερα.
Είστε καλά. Ευχαριστώ.